Welcome to everyone joining online. If you can log in to answer the Slido question, and we'll get started shortly.
Can people hear us out there? Can somebody give a signal saying they can
I
hear?
can.
Okay. Do you want to use this one? If Charlotte speaks now, can you hear her now?
Right. Can you hear me?
Not very well.
Why don't you intro, mute, and then I'll
bring this
here.
over. My name is George Littlejohn. I'm here very briefly to welcome you. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks to the two guys who were sitting near the chair store for putting out some more chairs. Very briefly, the CISI is the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, formerly part of London Stock Exchange until the 11th of February 1992, which was around the time of, and this is our Wi-Fi code here, when we moved in, 12th of February, 12/02, 1992, CISI guest if you want Wi-Fi. The exchange became a listed company, so it was inappropriate to have an educational body inside it. So they told us to go away, gave us some money. We had 3,000 members then. We became a charity, which we are. We got a royal charter from the late Queen 20 years ago. And having started with 3,000 members, we've now got 57,000 around the world. And our members work in wealth management, investment banking, and Islamic finance, corporate finance, and a few other things. But we're here to host you. I think Dominica, where's Dominica? Hello. Hi, sorry, right there, knows what happens if there's a fire, which is not very much. We just, I'll let you explain that. There is no fire alarm plans. Do follow me. I'll be running, but I'll make sure you all get out. And I'm just going to let that person in. If you want any more glasses or anything, just give me a shout. There's tea, coffee, and so on out there, but I'll get some more glasses in a minute. The loos are just by the entranceway, and I think that's about it in practicalities. But thanks to Charlotte, great thanks to Charlotte and the team here for making this work. Thank you very much, and welcome.
If you go on mute and I'll off mute.
Yes.
Can we just check that we're recording?
Just a flag that this event is.
I think you go off mute because you're on the speakers.
Please bear with us while we sort out.
Assistant who's taking
No problem at all. Could so we're going to have a creative workshop in the middle of this event. So we have a couple of facilitators for that. If you could just identify yourselves, maybe raise your hands, please. Lovely. Thank you very much. So if during the creative discussion, people could please kind of center themselves towards the facilitators. And thank you so much to our volunteers for coming forward. Are we able to?
I think we're good to go. Okay. I think this is an example that you can never have too many laptops or iPads or phones in trying to run an event. I'd like to extend my thanks to Legal Voices for the Future. It's been really good fun putting this event together when we brainstormed what we can think about in terms of being creative for what ESG is and ways to try and drive improvements and changing the needle. And I'm very excited to be joined by Laura Middleton, who leads PwC's ESG investigations, and she will tell us more about that. But as I'm sure many of you know, PwC is a very large consultancy. It also has an audit arm, and it does a whole variety of things across the globe. And Olivia, who is online, she's from Themis, which some of you may not have heard of, but it's a quasi-consultancy, but also an investigative and intelligence gathering arm. So very often, and she will talk a bit about her function, but talk a bit about actually what does it mean if you're boots on the ground? How do you actually dig into what your company is doing? Or if you're law enforcement, how do you go about finding out what is actually going on? I'm very pleased to see that we've had quite a few responses to the Slido. And for anyone online who's just joined, you can see the QR code at the bottom. We've got a couple of Slido questions coming up, so stay tuned. But it's great to see that everyone has picked up on that financial crime is something to do with money and finance. I really like the person who said something very complicated, and someone else who said it's not generally understood and it's a poorly understood area of the law, regulation and accounting. And that's one of the reasons why we will be talking about it today. It's also one of the reasons why the creative content is one page, which I know some of you were quite alarmed at, because today's session is going to be about how do we take something that is historically viewed as a tool to crack down on drug dealers or other forms of sort of stereotypical criminal activity and think about repurposing it for the ESG effort. So as you've already heard, the session is in 3 parts. You get to hear about me talk a lot about POCA, and we will be looking at some legislation. I can see you're all thrilled in the first part. That's going to really tee us up for the second part, which is the creative content. So you'll be in groups, you'll be broken into groups online. In the room, you will get into smaller groups to debate the creative content. And I will give you some prompts about that. But as a heads up, the creative content is going to be all about lateral thinking and brainstorming. So taking the dry legislation that I'm going to walk you through beginning, and then really letting your imaginations run wild to think, well, actually, how can we use that? And then we bring it all together in the third section, which is the panel discussion, where I won't really be saying anything because you will have heard enough from me, and Laura and Olivia will be trying to put into more tangible and real life context the sorts of things that this could mean. We will look at this from a perspective of law enforcement. So actually, how do you think about bringing actions against companies or individuals, as well as the perspective of being a company or an individual, thinking about how you can ensure that your business is really living and bringing the spirit of ESG as possible. So what is financial crime? Depending on who you talk to and certainly which lawyers' profiles you read, it can be anything from white-collar crime, business crime, economic crime. It's really dependent on the type of entity involved. So obviously white-collar crime and business crime, we largely think of corporates doing something bad, whereas financial crime, people might often think about money launderers and drug dealers. These are just a few of the criminal offences that might make up that element. And of course, you all know that for something like fraud, there are then a vast array of different types of fraud that then sit underneath that. This doesn't include sanctions, and also you'll be familiar that terrorist financing and other offences also fit under this. I've put the civil equivalents because I'm aware some of you come from a civil law background or practice. You get civil fraud, obviously. You also have different torts, unlawful means conspiracy. There's a whole raft out there. What these offences, whether civil or criminal, have in common is there's a focus on intent. And you will no doubt be familiar with the debate around the failure to prevent fraud offence and some of the changes that the government has brought into effect with the Economic Crime and Transparency Act. More on that later. Financial crime involves long-worded acts and acronyms. Part of the challenge is how do you hold a company to account? And there's some positive changes in that. But why are we getting excited about financial crime today? Well, Proceeds of Crime Act 2002 is the legislation that we're going to focus on today. This was originally brought in to really tackle drug dealing or gangs effectively dealing in all sorts of things, very much cash-based. It has evolved over the years, and if any of you read about the unexplained wealth order that the Serious Fraud Office brought recently, or you might have read several years ago about the Harrods shopper, the unexplained wealth orders fall under the Proceeds of Crime Act as well. Just to put some additional figures on this, good and bad, we can see that quite a lot was seized in its entirety the year prior to March last year. But when you put it into perspective, I believe it's 44 trillion globally of services and goods that are related to nature. So when you start to think about that, and we had some numbers in the advert for this event, again, environmental crime, so just environmental crime, not including human trafficking, that's already up in the billions. Again, that's a global figure. That number starts to look very small. The number starts to look even smaller when you take into consideration that this is targeting predominantly more traditional criminal behaviour. And one of the challenges with trying to find data is how does law enforcement and prosecution services tag things so that we can understand, right, it was money laundering, but what was it money laundering in relation to? Was it the nearly 3,000 turtles that were taken out of Madagascar in about the space of 2 months over Christmas or last year? Or is it something different? The one thing I will say about Proceeds of Crime now at this page is it is a very innovative act. It's quite scary. We'll get onto it, but one of the innovative elements is that it has an incentive scheme. So the body that brings, in essence, I will call it a prosecution, but the body that brings the recovery process, if they are successful, they get a percentage of the funds seized back. So the idea is ill-gotten assets should be removed from the person who has not followed the law, in essence, if I put it that way, to gain them. And the money should then go back into paying for either financial investigators or other budgetary needs for investigative teams. The idea is criminal funds can then go back into the system to enable more combating of crime. And the number to complement those figures, it was 98.1 million in September 2024 was distributed to pocket agencies. When you start to think about how expensive some of these investigations are, that number seems a little bit small, but it's a very good scheme because that's not money coming from the taxpayer, unless you take the view that the actual funds stolen are ultimately from the taxpayer. So what is Proceeds of Crime Act? Why is it interesting or scary? So it's what's called in rem, that's the Latin, but it's brought against the person, the property, not the person. So what that means is there's no finding of fact that the individual is what you might say, quote unquote, guilty. It's all about, is this property the product of criminality? Confiscation orders, which we are not going to look at today, do follow a conviction. So if someone is found guilty or they plead guilty, then that goes to having their assets removed. Civil recovery, which we are going to look at, it doesn't require any form of guilt to be proven or admitted. In fact, if someone goes to trial and they're found not guilty, that really is neither here nor there. You're then facing an account forfeiture or civil recovery. So you can start to get a sense that this might be quite a draconian act. It is civil standard of proof. So again, whilst we're talking about criminality, which is the criminal standard, you have to be sure the legislation, the tests related to taking property off someone is just balance of probabilities. So it's more likely than not. Proportionality is an element as well. So looking at the first of our two types of orders, civil recovery orders, minimum £10,000, brought in the High Court, 3 agencies can bring it: National Crime Agency, the CPS and Serious Fraud Office. The NCA can be referred cases from HMRC, the Financial Conduct Authority and others. Legal test is the property has to be in the UK or there's a relevant connection, and the test is that one-liner. The court is satisfied that any property is recoverable. This really goes to the property being representative of the unlawful conduct, which we'll get to. The idea being, if I've been involved in money laundering or some other form of criminality and I buy a very expensive house in the west of London, the house represents proceeds of that criminality. So a recovery order can go for effectively a representative amount. It doesn't have to be in the same form. So for example, if you convert it into crypto, some other form, it can still be pursued. We then go on to another type, which is an account freezing and forfeiture orders. I include the freezing because in order to make the account forfeiture, you have to have frozen the accounts beforehand. Civil recovery orders have what's called a property freezing order. They are often applied for, sometimes they're not applied for, but as you can imagine, freezing means whilst an investigation, an application eventually for forfeiture is ongoing, no one can do anything with those assets, and it's to prevent the risk of dissipation, which you can understand that some people might be quite keen to move their assets out of this jurisdiction if they think they're going to have them taken off them. This is quite different, and this is where things get quite interesting. So the minimum is £1,000 in the account, but there's a wide range of individuals or representatives that can bring these account freezing and forfeiture orders. And at the bottom, you see accredited financial investigator. Now, those are specially trained and qualified individuals, but they can work for local councils, local police forces. The Environment Agency has AFIs, as does DEFRA, City of London Police, Met Police, and Financial Conduct Authority, HMRC. The test is also quite interesting. So to freeze someone's account, the enforcement officer, so here I'm going to predominantly focus on, let's say, the AFI, so an accredited financial investigator to a local council, just needs to have reasonable grounds of suspicion that the money held in a bank account is recoverable property. So we'll come back to that phrase. or is intended by any person for use in unlawful conduct. You can probably imagine reasonable grounds for suspecting is a very low threshold. There's quite a lot of case law on it, but in essence, you can be wrong. It can be turn out that your suspicion has no factual basis. It's little more than belief, but you certainly don't need to know. So it's just enough to have reasonable suspicion. As a judge would say, plain words of the English language. So actually, very draconian. If you fall under someone's suspicion and it's reasonable, your account could be frozen if the money, all or part, is one of the two, recoverable property or intended for future use. When you then look to forfeiture orders, the legal test shifts slightly. The court has to be satisfied. So obviously this is now moving into a territory where on the civil balance of properties, there is in essence a finding of fact that it's recoverable property or intended by any person for use in unlawful conduct. So what is recoverable property? You can start to get a sense of why some people at the beginning said something very complicated. But you can hopefully, by this stage, start to see where legislation like this might be quite useful. So recoverable property is unlawful. I've added in the place where it occurs because we will touch on supply chain later. But it's got to be unlawful, so criminal offence in the UK and a criminal offence wherever we're saying the conduct occurred. So if it's illegal to chop down trees in Brazil and it's illegal to chop down trees without an appropriate license in this country, we've satisfied that measure. Criminal property, on the other hand, very briefly summarised, it represents a benefit from conduct that would be criminal if it took place in the UK. So recoverable property is property obtained through unlawful conduct. Remember, this is balance of probabilities. And how do you start then showing that this property is from unlawful conduct? Well, I've explained that it's an offence, but it doesn't have to be the person who has the property who committed the unlawful conduct. Someone else can have done it. And also, if we look at the very bottom in bold, you don't even have to specify what specific type of conduct it was. It can be conduct of one of a number of kinds, so it can be quite generalised. So if we think about what that means, it might be, we suspect Dominica's involved in selling drugs. But that can be it. You don't have to specify what type of drug, who she's selling it to, how she's selling it, who she's buying it from. It's generalised at the highest level. Money laundering, also, which we will look at later, we're not specifying what precisely is the specific type of money laundering. It's a general offence. First two bullet points summarise the remarks that I've just made. And then there's two particularly interesting cases that I've highlighted here. And so again, as you go into the creative content, have a think about the implications of what this might mean. Now, these two cases were related to confiscation, but they also talk in the judgment about what precisely makes something unlawful. So in the first case, McDowell, the question really posed was, what was the conduct that the statute, the piece of legislation, actually criminalised? And this is a key case when people think about crypto and money service bureaus. So in some pieces of legislation, in relation to this, the terrorist financing, so money laundering and terrorist financing, high risk sectors, so for example, art, high value art, or money service bureaus, do have licensing requirements because of the risk they pose in terms of potentially being avenues for money laundering. And of course, the failure to register with a money service bureau, as you can imagine, might be very high risk in terms of providing criminals or terrorists ability to move money through the financial system with no one being able to track it. So if the actual legislation says you have to hold a license in order to do X, and not doing that is then an offence, then that will fall under lawful conduct. So we're starting to move away from stereotypical, I'm carrying cocaine, therefore that's a criminal offence, to, well, actually, if I'm running an unlicensed business, or let's say I am felling trees and I don't have a license and the relevant law says that that's illegal, then we're wandering into the realm where we have recoverable property, which can then be pursued. The second case of King talks about, again, what is an unlawful business versus what is an unlawful transaction or part of a business. And in that case, someone was involved in selling cars, passed themselves off as a particular type of trader in order to get round from paying various guarantees and obligations. And the entire business model and how they sold themselves was therefore unlawful because it was integral to the business. They passed themselves off as something that they weren't. The gains they received from that was therefore unlawful. So again, to the point, you can start to see how this sort of thing might relate to the manner in which a company operates, how that then feeds into ESG, good governance, and ultimately why we might care about whether POCA can be used for ESG. This is a case that I mentioned because it's a very important case in terms of these proceedings. It also highlights just how broad these powers are. The case of Anwar, and the second point talks about the evidence and the circumstances that evidence points to, and vice versa. And it has this phrase that there's an irresistible inference. Effectively, you could have a lot of things that point to fishy conduct, but never actually quite precisely define what a company did or what a person did or what that property actually came from. But the surrounding circumstances are so odd that actually the test can be met just because how much of a coincidence is it that certain circumstances might come about. Now, a lot of this legislation and the case law derives from the police having suspicion that someone's involved in something dodgy. That's sufficient for the test to search someone's house. They go in, and when they're searching the wardrobe, at the back of a wardrobe in a suitcase, which has another suitcase inside it, which has a third bag inside it, and in the bag there's £200,000 in cash, all in £50 banknotes. That might be irresistible inference, because why would someone have that if they weren't involved in something dodgy? But that person could have been saving it for 20 years. They might have a cash-based business. They might not trust the banks. So there might be a whole range of legitimate factors, but actually the inference is irresistible. And there's one judgment that talks about in today's cashless society, it being very odd for people to carry cash. Therefore, if you have cash, you must somehow have recoverable property. We have another Slido question And I've thrown a huge amount of information at you. And this is trying to get you and trying to get us as a group and everyone online to start to think about where the opportunities for this might be leading us. And just for completeness, as we start to think about supply chains, POCA does contain a provision that actually, if someone gets rid of the recoverable property, so again, that's property from unlawful conduct, it remains recoverable. And whatever other property it is, so for example, let's say it's drugs, cocaine, and I appreciate I keep coming back to drug dealing, but it's quite a good visual. If that is cocaine and I then sell that for cash, the cash then becomes recoverable. So it doesn't matter what hands it's in essence, the criminality follows. And even if the property is converted into a different form, it's still representative. Just a word on the intended for future use part of the test, which, as many of you have probably realised from reading the words, that is, if the property, let's say that has been frozen in a bank account, so let's say my bank account is frozen, the view is if it was unfrozen and I then spent it, that act of spending it on a cup of tea from Starbucks is money laundering. So intended for future use, we can go back up to the test here, for use in unlawful conduct. So it's the money laundering is the unlawful conduct. That is a very wide vision. It effectively relies on the irresistible inference, saying it's so fishy, but we might not even be able to specify the type of offence. So therefore, the hurdle of recoverable property isn't even met. We just think it's so suspicious that if this money were to be spent or anything was to be done with it, that would amount to money laundering. So if you're ever worried about the powers our government has, that is quite frightening when you really think about what it means. Very briefly, because this is a very well-known offence, group of offences, and of course it relates to supply chains. So there are different types of ways of committing money laundering. We've concealing, obviously, that is very obvious. Converting, that would be converting form, so cash to money in a bank account, or you've got funds in a bank account that you then convert into crypto. It's changing the type, so the actual, the form of the property, or sending it abroad. Arrangements, this is when you're knowing or suspecting. So if you do something that might facilitate an arrangement, whether that is acquisition, retention, use, control, you're doing it on behalf of someone else. Again, this is money laundering. This is probably something that you're all very familiar with. There are some defences. So to recoverable property, you have a defence of if you're a bona fide purchaser, so good faith for value and without notice, so not knowing that it was recoverable property, then effectively when you get the property, when you buy it or purchase it, it ceases to become recoverable, so you break the chain. I put section 329 up. That relates to criminal property, and it talks about acquiring or using or had in possession something for adequate consideration. Everyone's still with me? Good. Some of the answers. everyone is touching on. I don't know whether any of you can see everyone else's answers when you enter it. But yes, human trafficking, greenwashing, green finance, green loans, bonds, securitization, unlawful sourcing of raw materials, bribery and procurement, yes. Ex-employee taking private documents from the company before departing, yes. These are all things that would constitute unlawful conduct. So you'd have them under recoverable property, and civil recovery orders, I will touch on, are usually the easiest because they are representative. The account order, you're effectively saying that money in the account is all or in part from the product. Wrapping up the law and getting to the why should you care. Hands up in the room, and apologies to everyone online, but you can do the thumbs up emoji. Who has heard of this case? Okay, few hands in the room. So, as many of you are aware, the Uyghur, or I believe it's also pronounced Uyghur, region in China is very well known, and it's highly publicized that there is an extreme amount of forced labor. And in fact, it's such that it is now assumed that anything coming from that region in China is the product of forced labor. So whether that's forced labor in picking cotton to then forced labor in the factories that are then converting the raw cotton into material that will end up in the t-shirts that we wear and so on. Now, World Uyghur Conference wrote to the NCA and effectively said, why aren't you going after companies that import goods from that region? Because the evidence is such that it can be said that that is, whether it's criminal property or recoverable property, it can be pursued. And you might have read more recently about Shein. There's been another NGO that has effectively raised to the NCA that surely the profit made from t-shirts and clothing made from cotton that has come from the Uyghur region should be seized. So by way of civil recovery order, recoverable property, and there is some debate around that. Now, the NCA, when they received the communication from the World Uyghur Conference asking why they weren't pursuing companies who were importing and wherever in the supply chain property and goods from the Uyghur region, instead of saying we don't have resource and ending it there, because you'll be aware from judicial review that resourcing is an area that is at the discretion of the public authority. The court is not going to wade into resourcing matters. They then provided a decision letter which set out reasons why they felt that POCA didn't apply, and they got the law wrong. So the World Uyghur Conference took them obviously to court, and they challenged the decision. And one of the points was, did it have to be specific criminality, specific property? So the answer to that is no. But then it talked about actually, what did the defence of adequate consideration mean? And interestingly, the court decided that 329 and 308 are in essence the same. So adequate consideration effectively meant that property is only cleansed if there is adequate consideration and good faith on the part of a buyer, and that buyer was not on notice of underlying criminality. And if you think back to the definition of criminal property, and if anyone would like these slides, we will share them, we have that phrase, know and suspect. So suspicion low threshold. And that's something that I know Laura's going to talk about around, well, what does this mean for supply chains? This is a quote which I will let you all read in your own time. 57 and 56 are very interesting. And then there's sort of this idea around, well, actually, if you are really a bona fide and innocent purchaser, not on notice, do you break the chain? And what happens if later on someone is doing due diligence and they actually do have a suspicion that this cotton or this teak that they're going to use has been derived from criminal property, or has the chain actually been broken? And how does that company prove that there really was an innocent bona fide entity in the middle of the supply chain? So you might question, does having really good due diligence actually help you or not? Question for another time. Lastly, failure to prevent fraud. You'll have heard about this. This focuses on benefit indirectly or directly, and it has to have a UK connection. So fraud, in essence, anywhere in the world, if it touches on the UK in some way, so victims of fraud or the entity or the third party, this offence, which is coming into effect this year, this allows the CPS, or the Serious Fraud Office, to pursue it. And I know that in the guidance, there are about 6 examples focused on greenwashing. So certainly when the guidance was written and published in September, November last year, I can't quite remember, ESG was clearly at the front of the mind of the draftsman. It has a very interesting change to corporate criminal liability as well. So this is in essence trying to get away from a whole body of case law that talks about a directing mind and will. And if you think about a very large corporate today, it's very hard to say who actually does what and make what decision, because things are delegated down. So is the CEO a directing mind and will? And does the CEO have to know that something dodgy is going on in order for the corporate to be liable? This change in the law is to try and get around that and make it far easier to prosecute companies. What does this mean for ESG? And that's a question that you're about to turn to in the brainstorming. If we think about fundamental drivers of business, it's their bottom line. Paying a fine is very, very painful. What POCA allows is effectively a fine to be imposed by taking away property, whether that's criminal property or recoverable property. The benefit also is you're actually getting back some of the proceeds, and certainly for the government agencies, they're getting a percentage of that, and that should have a very virtuous cycle of enabling greater resource to bring greater recovery efforts. This might be a way, and certainly it's a lower threshold, arguably, of holding companies to account. We remember back to the very first slide when we talked about some of the criminal offences and even some of the civil, the ways that you could bring a civil case. They all focus on intent or one form of the other. How do you prove someone was dishonest? Because there's never really a smoking gun email that says, I know what we're doing is wrong, I know this is a lie, but let's do it anyway. That's very rare. And think about the amount of disclosure and how you'd even get that information from a company. You're going to be dumped with thousands upon thousands of files if you get to the stage where you can actually pursue disclosure. POCA, as we've discussed, is very draconian and the thresholds are very low. So there might be an instance, and I think recently on the news there's been the coverage of the BBC tracking down that tyres have been sent to India for effectively illegal disposal. Well, is that not something that POCA can pursue? Do you have to have intent that the person knew that the savings that they were bringing by shipping their tyres off to be disposed in an illegal way, was that wrong? Or can we actually just say the profits they made from the savings of disposing the tyres in this way is enough? We know that there was unlawful conduct. It's illegal in India. It's illegal here. Is it that simple? So there's a way of thinking about it and a way of thinking, how can we use this very low, still hard to beat, because obviously people have defences and they will respond to this, but you're not having to prove intent. It's a civil standard. Potentially, this could be very effective. And on that, we're going to break off into the creative content. If you have any questions from the presentation, pop them in the Slido. Olivia, Laura, and I will start looking at them. But do have a think about all the ways in your current jobs you think that POCA might be useful, but also in all the reading and engagement you have in ESG matters, how POCA might be a tool, and what might be the pros and cons. So we have hard copies of the one-pager. We will also put it up on the screen as well. The key question is, how can using POCA, or if you want to be really creative, you can think about civil as well. Unjust enrichment might be a very good example. How you can really drive that. And the piece that you will have read or about to read really relates to how do we break the consumer cycle and materialistic cycle that largely drives a lot of the use of cheap products, invariably linked to unlawful conduct, in order to try and change company behaviour. Does anyone have any questions on the creative content?
How long do we have to sort this one out?
15 minutes. What we're looking for is almost like a brainstorming approach. So lots of ideas. The ideas, we're not looking for high quality, but we're really looking to get the brain juices flowing. Any other questions?
Go ahead.
Yes, sure. So without further ado, let's split into groups. We'll have 10 minutes to discuss, and then potentially up to 5 minutes for people from each of the groups to feedback and to tell us kind of in a nutshell what they've discussed. So if the facilitators could please raise their hands again, and I'm actually one too. So if we could just make, a couple of clusters around the facilitators.
One of these facilitators could go over there because there's maybe a little bit of a lack.
Yeah, and we can move chairs around, kind of have a small circle going. So.
Just everyone online, got a minute left. Right, everyone, we are going to make a stop to the creative content there. If everyone can, on this side of the room, turn your chairs in so you can see that corner. Thanks, everyone. You will have to project your voices at the back of the room so that this laptop can keep you up. Or if it's easier for one of you to come forward, do so.
Okay.
Who would like to offer the views from this group at the back?
Hello, everyone. So we had interesting, quite wide-ranging discussion, starting with the language in the text here, noting the beautiful writing festival. But also what is striking is the foresight that you can see already 150 years ago on the environmental problems that were already in evidence. And so picking up on different parts of what might the E, what might the S be in this scenario here, and the problems, the environmental problems that we can see. Very worth noting that this age of iron is still ongoing, and especially in some parts of the world where this description isn't outdated at all. So it's still very much the present. And so with globalization and everything, we maybe have come to a bit of a physical distancing, moral distancing from these problems, but that doesn't mean they've gone away. In terms of POCA and the contribution it could make to counteracting some of this, it was noted that due diligence would play a big part in creating accountability and drawing attention to such problems, especially combined with personal liability of leading managers and executives to really make it effective. And we finished on a discussion about this issue of, are we too materialistic as a society to really escape all of this? And the point was made that actually it might be the fact that it is approaching it from the financial dynamics of the whole system as it is that might make it effective, actually, because it could integrate into a sort of business as usual as an upside. The problem with that being, of course, that some things just can't be quantified, quality of the environment, quality of life, and some things can't just be recovered financially. So some hope and some skepticism.
What about this? Oh, yes.
Yeah, so in terms of the extract, I mean, like, on first glance, it's quite abstract. You know, we were just sort of like, you know, how are we sort of applying this in terms of like consumer behavior, and then also having a kind of like initial reluctance to hold sort of consumers responsible for really the actions of quite harmful corporates who are like profiting massively from the like cheap forced labor elements of their products. And yes, it's being forced onto, it's not being forced, yes, it's being consumed by the public, but in what ways are you know, harmful corporate actors driving this consumer behavior. And when the products are being made in areas of the world that are so sort of remote and far removed from the consumer, in what ways is the consumer not really connecting with the erosion not only of the environment in these contexts, but of you know, the workers and the people making these products as well. So, and yeah, on that vein, we started thinking about, like, you know, in what ways is POCA active in forced labour contexts, in supply chain contexts as well. And I think, yeah, the general sort of feeling was like, it's kind of lacking teeth. It's not really, there's quite a, you know, quite a bit of reluctance when it comes to actually connecting forced labour, modern slavery issues with POCA. Like, it's, you know, you mentioned a couple of examples, but in general, from our experiences, it's not something. So then it, I think, to build on the points of the team, to build on your points before, but points to the need of, like, not only POCA, but also so many other UK statute legislation pieces that are just like really lacking teeth when it comes to actually addressing any modern slavery or forced labour issues. So again, pointing to the need for mandatory due diligence legislation. We've got kind of piecemeal, you know, bits of legislation dealing with bits of supply chain issues in isolation. But I think, yeah, kind of what we're seeing, CSDDD and other mandatory human rights due diligence pieces coming through in other jurisdictions as well. We need something that's kind of tying things all together. And there's lots of ways in which to do that, you know, imposing.
I think on that point, just so that you don't take away all the points that Laura's going to say, that's exactly where we're heading in the panel, is how to bring it all together and how to use supply chain governance and so on. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
It's more babbling about the need for that.
This group.
We, I think, probably focus less on the tech than other people. We were like, this gives us anxiety, and then flowed into other areas. And I think we touched on a lot of the other points mentioned by the other groups, but a key point that we kind of came to at the end was we ended up actually discussing regulation a lot, and then kind of the distinction between, well, do criminal sanctions work better, or does regulation work better? And obviously the kind of sanction fining people and regulation like due diligence, etc., and putting that through supply chains in some cases might be more effective, because if you're looking at the big companies, they might be like, fine, we'll take that money and carry on. And it depends who the actor is, and actually regulating kind of make them change their behavior rather than just kind of paying a fine and carrying on. And we do about kind of accountability and where you look at that and kind of moving certain activities to different jurisdictions where it might not be a crime, or making things not traceable. And then the issues of having, obviously from a diligence perspective, you want to be able to trace completely through your supply chain, but then we talked about from an IP perspective what that means, and kind of people wanting to kind of be able to maintain ownership of their supply chain, their IP, and their kind of trade secrets almost, but then how that conflicts with the need for transparency. So we went quite far reaching.
Thank you. I did think this group were going to cry at one point. Last group. If anyone online wants to share any comments, do put them in the chat function. What did your group have?
Well, everyone has spoken so adequately, so we'll keep it short. We started just by enjoying some of the language in the text and extrapolating a kind of value change that might be necessary from that. This idea of hitching our wagons to not to the stars but to the streams, and wondering from that whether, you know, and then Libby made the point that if you take someone like AML, which is often the first point of contact if you're onboarding a client, for example, if you have a value change about what AML can be, or a shift in understanding, then that can really help catch things much earlier on. Then we just talked a lot of different things. but we talked about, well, you know, some of the sort of fruitier language about sort of devil's laboratory and the idea of maybe giving agency, good or bad, to certain activities or certain things, and that idea of legal personhood in the environment. And then we had a sort of finish talking about POCR itself and thinking, well, you know, and then as other groups mentioned about supply chains, you know, if looking from a UK perspective, maybe it's unrealistic to think about the UK nature. We're very much focusing on the E here. But if you look at London as a financial centre and you think about, if, you know, because it has that sort of element of if things are illegal in other jurisdictions, then, you know, can you recover the property here? Just think about flows of capital, flows of goods in and out of London, and how POCR can maybe capture some of that.
And that's, I think we've got one in the chat. That was Ola. So we're going to move on to the panel discussion now. And it really builds on all the points that you've made. So I'm going to stop talking, apart from ask a few questions. Olivia, just checking that you can hear us.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Laura, what does ESG investigations mean? What do you do?
Whole heap of things. So I am a forensic accountant. Some of you probably work with forensic accountants on some people's jobs, possibly. Basically, our job is usually to investigate fraud, to establish the facts, and often to calculate the quantum of the impact. It can be much broader than that. We often work with legal counsel as well, and some of those roles are shared, but that's the general principles of it. I am a forensic accountant. I actually really don't enjoy accounting. It's not the proper accounting. So I suppose if you think of a proper traditional forensic accounting investigation, it'd be something like HP Autonomy, which we did, it's like a £5 billion black hole, lots of really super technical accounting investigation to work out exactly what happened and who was responsible. I do much more of the work. It used to be just referred to as non-financial investigations. It's now ESG, certainly in the broadest sense of the term. So just to give you a feel for the types of things I look at, I, as you'd expect, do quite a lot of work in the bribery and corruption space. So I was part of the team that looked at the Glencore bribery case. I've done a lot of work in hospitals, looking at what happens when their governance goes wrong, and that can lead to some sort of corporate manslaughter type issues too. I've been involved in water pollution, so that's in the press all the time. I can give you some examples about that. And right now I'm looking at insulation, very badly installed insulation across the country, which is ESG because it's generally installed as part of the government's net zero scheme. So you've got funding for ESG going towards some very, very criminal builders, which is interesting. But
just on that point, you made a really interesting point earlier to me that actually a lot of people you work with are investigative journalists. That might be quite surprising in terms of who are the people actually interested in what's going on.
Yeah, I guess I started focusing on ESG as a defined term probably 3-4 years ago, and I thought by now most of my work would be kind of like the bribery side of things, driven by regulatory action. So we tend to work for the companies that are being accused of bribery, absolutely not to get them off the hook, but very much to just help them to respond to those big regulatory investigations. It's not really happened. And actually a lot of the work I've done right now has been, again, commissioned by companies that have been accused, but they've generally been accused in the court of public opinion. So it might be panoramas, quite common, or short sellers or that sort of thing. So it's companies' leadership wanting to reassure their stakeholders, I suppose, that they're on top of this. Either there isn't an issue, or, as will probably become apparent from a lot of my examples, it's a lot less black and white than it appears, or indeed to get everything out so that they can start again and do it properly this time.
And Olivia, you do something fairly similar at Themis. Can you describe the angle that Themis takes? And also you've done a couple of reports with WWF. Perhaps you could just give a bit of a flavour of what they are as well. And actually, Olivia, while you're thinking about giving your answer, perhaps I should ask you to define what do we mean by ESG and how have you defined environmental crime, certainly in your work with WWF?
Yeah, so we have an investigations team at Themis which does quite similar stuff to what Laura was describing. My team, which is Insight, is sort of more of the macro geopolitical kind of trends, the threat-based landscape, the kind of financial crime landscape that we see by talking to law enforcement and border officials in different countries. We do a lot of work with financial institutions to see what their kind of controls are in different countries, what their appetites are, what the sort of funding looks like to certain crime types in different countries as well. And I think in terms of environmental crime, so the sort of the WWF work that you mentioned, that's part of a multi-year partnership. So we do a lot of, we have a range of clients that are in the public sector and the private sector, NGOs like WWF and also sort of governments across the world. But with WWF, we've been working with them for a couple of years to sort of create these big research reports on environmental crime types. So we've kind of broken them down thematically, and we focused on deforestation and the illegal wildlife trade, an upcoming one on illicit mining, but really looking at that from the perspective of financial institutions, because the sort of couple of ex-bankers that we're working with at WWF who work there now, who their very strong opinion is that, you know, the finance industry is funding a lot of this stuff, inadvertently a lot of the time, we hope, but that's a real kind of lever for change there. So a lot of our research through them has really focused on what are the kind of points that are going to really get the financial industry to care. Is it when you were sort of talking earlier about the 44 trillion dollars that's sort of, you know, dependent on nature, about 50% of GDP is dependent on nature. So is it that kind of physical risk that financial institutions are you know, going to encounter if they're financing activity that is degrading the environment, but they're also, you know, loaning money sort of for capital loans and things to companies that are dependent on the environment? You know, are they shooting themselves in the foot there? Is it from the kind of the AML angle? Is it the fact that environmental crime converges so significantly with lots of other financial crimes, even if they don't care about illegal deforestation? Do they care about tax evasion? Those sorts of things. So we've done these reports, but we've also created this toolkit, which is meant to be full of quite sort of practical resources for financial institutions to sort of risk assess their exposure and kind of mitigate it, and sort of incorporate red flags and things like that into their existing systems and controls. When you talk about environmental crime and the definition, it's sort of, as you've already kind of hinted at, it's very difficult to universally agree on a definition. That, you know, lots of reasons for this. Obviously, legal frameworks are different, different cultures and different languages have different approaches to nature. So, you know, there isn't one universally agreed definition. I mean, when we were doing this deforestation report, we found that there were over 800 definitions of the word forest around the world. So, you know, you can't define deforestation if you can't even really agree on a definition for the word forest. So there are a lot of difficulties there. But the way that we tend to approach it is by breaking it down into these sort of subtypes, as I was talking about, you know, the illegal wildlife trade, waste trafficking, illegal deforestation, illegal mining. But obviously those aren't distinct categories. They really overlap. You have to illegally deforest in order to illegally mine. And often when you've illegally deforested, you're then going to be illegally trafficking, you know, the timber from that. So they aren't distinct, but that's kind of how we use it in our research, really, as an umbrella term. But yeah, I think the sort of the lack of definition is a real problem, because then how do you get a unified response? And that's has fed in, I think, to this sense that there are sort of lower penalties around the world for it, and that's what attracts so many criminals to it, because of the kind of high profit, low risk nature of crime. And that's why we're seeing sort of increasing organised crime gangs really drawn to this trade as well, which is what a lot of our research has focused on.
And perhaps, Olivia, I can ask you to give us a practical example of where something has started in a non-UK country and it's ended up impacting the UK. And then Laura, I might ask you to just walk everyone through the steps of if you got the phone call from someone related to this, how do you even go about figuring out what's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of very interesting examples, particularly kind of going into the US, but in the UK, so talking about illegal deforestation earlier, there's a lot of stuff there around all of these high risk deforestation commodities. So things like soy and palm oil, rubber, timber, cattle, coffee, cocoa, minerals that are in all of the electronics that we have, all of these sorts of things which end up in the UK and start life in the Amazon or in Asia or something like that. And there are very, very complicated sort of methods of kind of laundering those, if those are often the products of illegal deforestation. So land clearing without the right permits, often on protected land, potentially on sort of indigenous land, and often that land is often used for cattle example, as an example in the kind of Central America. Is really used as cattle ranches are really used to sort of launder the profits of drugs trafficking as well. So you're laundering the profits through these farms and these activities, but you're also doing illegal deforestation in the process as well. So there's that sort of environmental crime element, and the way that cattle is then laundered into the legal market by traveling sort of through borders up across Central America. They go into different ranches. They're stamped in different ways. They might be shaved in different ways. They lead a very sort of merry dance, these kind of cattle across the country before getting into a supply chain, and then they go through different sort of packaging plants and processes. Trying to track it is extremely, extremely difficult, and then they end up in supermarkets and they can be labelled as from a deforestation-free branch that they're assumed to be licit, and they're actually very much the proceeds of crime, both sort of narco crime and also environmental crime. So yeah, cattle is an extremely high risk commodity.
Now, Laura, would a supermarket be calling you up and saying, it turns out that we've got these poor illicit cattle in the system, or is it a journalist? And then once you get that phone call, what happens next?
Quite an interesting one. The actually find the general response from supermarkets is we'll just ditch that supplier. And you mentioned CSDDD, that's absolutely very explicitly that's not what you should be doing in these cases. The aim is to improve and to stop this type of issue from happening rather than to just ditch that person, that company as a supplier. In terms of how we'd look into that, I mean, that is a really complex one. And I think, as Olivia said, trying to trace that is really, really tough. That would not be an easy thing to do. I suppose in terms of the sort of tools and techniques you might use, there's going to be a huge amount of data analytics and that sort of thing. You're looking for something that connects all of those different stages and all of the different funds to allow you to kind of trace something through I'll call it a supply chain, but it's not just supply chain, it's flow of monies as well. None of those are going to match up, so you're going to need to do some pretty sophisticated we would normally in an investigation use e-discovery, and some of your law firms, you might have e-discovery practices yourselves as well. In something like this, it's quite tough because if you're just doing an investigation in a company, you can grab the emails of the people who might be implicated, you can analyse them and review them. Once you start looking down a supply chain, you don't really have the right to do that. So e-discovery has some merit, but not necessarily, it's not as effective as it would be maybe in a traditional investigation because you simply can't get the information and data that you would do otherwise. There are tools you can use using like satellite imagery, for example. If you're looking at deforestation, you might be able to evidence things that way. It's an unrelated case, but we had one ages ago where we were able to use vehicle tracking data from a company to see where there was illegal dumping. So there's all sorts of different data sources that you can kind of piece together that story. And again, if you've got looking at a different burden of proof, that might be sufficient to try and track everything together. Other piece probably that I then draw out is corporate intelligence, and I know certainly Olivia has that in business as well. That is really looking at public data sources that might give you some information to try and link and understand what's going on. It's more than just Googling. There will be all sorts of databases out there that, you know, the paid databases, they're legal databases from different companies, different countries. Some countries you need to physically go out there in person. So I think Mexico is a great example. If you want records about companies there, you've got to go to an office in person to get them in paper. Others, obviously, you can get it through different databases. But you can use corporate intelligence again to start making those connections between different entities, different individuals. That person's a director there. They own these assets. That doesn't look right. You just started to piece the puzzle together. And you can use maybe human source intelligence in that range as well. So getting people in country to give you that insight and intelligence that you wouldn't know if you were based elsewhere.
Before I ask both of you about the involvement in what you've seen about law enforcement or any form of government or regulatory investigation and then a prosecution. Just taking what you've said and reflecting on the point that you made earlier. So CSDDD and CSRD is European legislation, is a bit of a shock to everyone's system at the moment because they've started to roll it back and really pause and neuter a lot of it, but effectively says for a company of a certain size, you've got to know your supply chain inside out. And it's not just your third party, but it's your fourth party, fifth party. So if you are a large corporate and you might have 5,000 third parties, you can very quickly see how that explodes in terms of numbers if you're then to know your third parties, and so on. So, Laura, this sounds very complicated to investigate when you know that you're looking for something. So you know that you might be sourcing cattle illegally. If you're a company who doesn't know what criminality might be in its supply chain, how do they do that? What is the governance framework? And certainly for people here today who work for law firms who might be advising corporates or startups who are looking to challenge corporates, what can people be thinking of and looking for?
Again, it's really tough. The starting point is just mapping that supply chain, and that is really not easy. This is a bit of an old example, but one I use just to illustrate it. If you take a clothing retailer, a lot of them are actually pretty sophisticated in the way they seek to understand where their cotton's coming from for exactly the reasons you talked about with weak labour. They will do DNA testing on their cotton so they can trace that to the field. They know where that's come from. What they can't necessarily do is piece that together. You've got your kind of tier one supply chain. You know who you're buying the clothes from. What's happening in the middle? Who's doing the weaving? It's quite often a very small place. It might change quite frequently. You know, these supply chains are dynamic. You don't know what's happening there, whether there's slave labour, whether there's anything else there. So they almost have this weird split supply chain. They know this side, they know this bit, and they don't really know what's going on in the middle. And as I say, it's very much dynamic. Things change all the time. So even if you did a massive mapping exercise, you look at it again in 6 months, it's probably all moved, but you certainly couldn't rely on it. I think CSDDD is probably the first piece of legislation that really asks you to go that far down the supply chain. Most of the stuff we worked on historic kind of looks at the first couple of tiers. So that is a big change. I think that's been part of the anxiety about what does that mean in practice. In terms of how people investigate, there's, I think the other piece of thought leadership that might be helpful is a piece that both Olivia and I both worked on with Transparency International, really, that looks at some of the different practical approaches that companies can take to take what they're already doing around bribery and anti-corruption work and adapt that to some of these ESG risks. It's not perfect. It needs a lot of tailoring. So the type of due diligence you do on third parties to pick up bribery is very different to human rights or environmental crime, but there are structures and processes there, and that was very much where we'd suggest that people start. And also that collaboration piece. So certainly I was talking to a mining company who've been doing ESG stuff for ages, not very effectively necessarily, but it's split all over the company. You know, there's someone responsible for health and safety, there's someone else responsible for their sustainability reporting, someone else looks at human rights. It's how you bring all of that together is really key too. And then I think the other piece is focusing those resources. So you've got, I don't know, a supply chain of 1,000 entities. You can't go out and do an audit on each of them. And frankly, audits aren't that effective anyway. If you're looking at human rights, you're not really going to see that on the ground unless you've got some pretty sophisticated techniques. So it's how do you work out what your risk indicators are and where you really focus some of your techniques, whether it's some of that corporate intelligence, for example. It might be on the ground audits. For some of the lower risks, it's simply policies, procedures, confirmations, the normal, slightly boring compliance type pieces. But it's really working out where you focus that risk and demonstrate that you've thought about it and put those sort of adequate procedures in place.
And Olivia, in terms of your reports and your work, how important is human intelligence, so whistleblowers? Or did you find that wasn't really a factor in working out the supply chain or the illegal activity?
I think it's so important. As Laura was saying, there is a lot of countries and a lot of these very resource-rich countries where the data isn't really there. And the head of our investigations team is actually a former investigative journalist, so he's got a very strong global network of people on the ground, and that's where you get information that you're not going to find anywhere else. The difficulty with some of that stuff is how you need to approach it very much in the right way, because you don't want to raise, well, in terms of sort of putting those people in danger, but just also in terms of making sure that those kind of sources of data are sort of remain, that you need to do that in very, very discreet ways. The problem in a lot of these places as well, that are very kind of resource rich, where a lot of environmental crime takes place everywhere, but where a lot of it takes place is that a lot of these whistleblowers are sort of, well, assassinated, frankly, afterwards. Is a case of someone we were looking at in Peru, who was a timber trafficking kind of drug lord, really, and he ended up being elected to mayor of a Peruvian province. And there was a journalist who kept on writing about him, and he just sort of kept on members of his family, sort of threats, violence, all that sort of stuff, and he was eventually assassinated. And those are the sorts of things where those protections for whistleblowers are often not particularly strong in those sorts of jurisdictions. But yeah, I think human source intelligence is it has a place that you sometimes just can't find stuff without humans on the ground. And I think the conversations that we have, both sort of NGOs who are on the ground in these places, as well as kind of law enforcement, sort of border officials, but people who, so for example, park rangers, are crucial sources of data. Absolutely.
So I'm going to give you again the question that's going to come after this question, and just for everyone's awareness, we are finishing it by 8:30, so don't worry. A thank you to those who've already put questions in the Slido chat. So the question that will be coming up is effectively reflecting on the entire session. What do you think the future means for either private prosecutions, law enforcement, or government prosecutions, or the use of a tool like POCA being revamped? Before you get to that, I asked you both the question earlier of, what is your experience of prosecutions being brought, criminal and then civil proceedings as well?
I think in some of the more traditional areas, there's been a fair amount. So a lot of my work has historically been on what you class as the G, I suppose, the governance side of things. Question the success of some of the serious fraud officers' cases, but they certainly, the one I was on, they got hundreds of millions of pounds, rightly so, for some of those activities. I think on the environmental and the social side, probably less so at the moment. I guess in some of the traditional areas that you've talked about, there are examples, and deforestation, and actually around the carbon credit frauds as well. We've got some decent examples there, but it's not at the level I was hoping it would be, and I don't think it's the level that the impact that these issues have on people on the planet absolutely warrants right now. And frankly, the amount of money that people are making about it, the trillions that you referenced, it's not backed up, I don't think, in law enforcement at the moment.
Olivia, what about you?
Well, a lot of our research is focused not so much on UK cases, but I guess similar to Laura, I would say not a huge amount that I've seen of kind of convictions for environmental crime. It's more for sort of people who are engaging in environmental crime are prosecuted for adjacent or enabling crimes. So for the things like tax evasion or corruption and bribery, rather than for the actual environmental crime kind of component itself, which suppose in some ways you could say doesn't matter if they are being prosecuted, and actually those crimes often have a longer sort of a more severe penalty. But I think that's contributing to the sense that it is a lower risk crime, and also possibly the kind of the dearth of data, not dearth, but the comparative lack of data as compared to some of these other crimes when it comes to things like red flags that companies can actually look out for themselves. So it sort of forms part of a slightly vicious cycle.
So future, what do you think is going to happen?
If you'd asked me a few months ago, or perhaps pre-November, I would absolutely expect there to be greater focus on this. I think the sort of message I've heard from some enforcement agencies is not necessarily a standalone focus on some of these areas, but just embedding it in a lot of their traditional investigations. I think we were starting to see a few examples of that coming through, but I was speaking to someone who's worked both DOJ and the SFO, and they were talking about, we will be looking at greenwashing in every investigation we do. Might not be there, but it is a relevant part of cases. Now, I'm not so confident. I'm not particularly political, but I think certainly from the work I do, it's been apparent that there's just been a complete shift, and certainly for the parts of our organisation that look more at the reporting side of things, so CSRD, CSDDD, the work is still absolutely there and people are still very much focused on it, but we're seeing quite a split. You look at pressure from shareholders, the US shareholders versus the European ones, it's chalk and cheese. It's incredibly different. I'd be interested to see how that flows through some of the enforcement agencies and the cases that we start to see in court. But I'm maybe not expecting quite as much as I was for the next 4 years, unfortunately. I hope I'm wrong.
Olivia.
I'd love to be more optimistic, but sadly, I think I agree. I think the aid cuts as well, sort of on environmental stuff in America, that that impacts, because a lot of that aid went into international research projects around sort of environmental bits and bobs which are adjacent to environmental crime. So I think that'll have a massive knock-on impact. I think there is the possibility that sort of more insular, kind of inward-looking, more nationalistic focus will be echoed, I guess, around the world. And I think that one of the most important things with environmental crime is kind of cross-border data sharing and collaboration, because the proceeds of it flow across borders, the physical products of it flow across borders. So that would be that may have a really bad impact. From a sort of organised crime perspective, I tend to change my mind very much depending on what mood I'm in, as to whether I think the increasing involvement of serious organised crime gangs in environmental crime is cause for increased law and more in this space in terms of law enforcement, as they realize that it is really an issue of national security and international security, as we've got these sort of mafias and these cartels and terrorist groups sort of enriching themselves through this activity. Sometimes that makes me think there's going to be more prioritization of it. It's environmental crime is very high on Interpol and Europol's lists of priorities. They've put it as one of their key pillars and areas. But then I also sometimes think that actually that involvement, the more that happens, the more that those groups will be able to, have people, sort of corrupt people in positions of power in law enforcement, in sort of political spaces, that actually might also impede how much this stuff gets prosecuted. So yeah, I'd say today I'm feeling quite pessimistic about it, but fingers crossed, there could be cause for optimism.
Does anyone in the room have a question that is going to be less than 10 seconds to say out loud? Yes.
How long does it currently take for you to investigate the
someone to come to you for an investigation, and how short should that be for meaningful impact to happen?
Really varies. Generally it's pretty quick actually. I quite often find once you get 2-3 weeks away from, let's say, whistleblower is your trigger, people tend to lose enthusiasm and start to justify why it's maybe not such a big deal. So tends to come relatively quickly. I think the earlier the better for us, because you can speak off offences and all sorts of things, but the more you can gather evidence before people are aware, the better, frankly.
And how long might an investigation take?
I think our longest one is going 15 years. In fairness, that's still it's the court proceeding, so we kind of hold the data. So where there's different bits of it come to court, can't remember if I'm allowed to talk about that one. I won't, just in case. Generally, most of them are done within kind of 3 months. You have where you then get some of your regulatory agencies involved. So like the SFO's cases tend to take, I think, Project Train, which is the Glencore one, is about 6 years in now. We're obviously through the main bit. We're now looking at individual prosecutions, so they can drag on, but the core bit's usually done in a few months.
The questions that were posted on Slido, some of them were a little bit existential, such as how did you end up in your respective fields? What was your career journey? And what are the main gaps in knowledge that we come across? We will answer these in the email that goes out. We will provide the slides and we'll provide a list of resources. To wrap, thank you very much for coming. There is a degree of pessimism, as Laura and Olivia have articulated, in terms of how politics might shape. But the view I take is very few people are talking about POCA. Very few people are sitting down with laws like this and thinking, well, what if? Yes, only certain types of qualified people or institutions can bring actions under POCA, but actually, can we be really creative and think about, well, what does this, or what does World Uyghurs Congress as a case mean for potentially a civil claim, which we haven't touched on? And I hope that you all go away thinking about this and just turning over in your mind what might be and how might we do things differently. I'd like to end by thanking Laura and Olivia very much for joining us, and thank you all for attending.
Yes, just to very quickly wrap up. Thank you so much to Charlotte for leading the session and amazing speakers. Thank you to George as well and CISI for hosting us in this fantastic venue. And you will see in front of you a couple of QR codes, which will introduce you to ways in which you can engage with Legal Voices for the future. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that we do run these knowledge session events every month. So if this brilliant event inspired you to try it out for yourself, please do reach out to us, scan the QR code, and you can submit your idea to us. We'd be happy to facilitate this and kind of support you in organizing one of these events. We are an entirely volunteer-run organization, so if you do feel so inclined, we would greatly appreciate your Buy Me a Coffee donations on another QR code. And we have actually run quite relevant knowledge sessions in the past. We have done one specifically on ESG. We have done one on illegal wildlife trade, as well as one on human rights and due diligence. And so if you scan the YouTube QR code, you can see those recordings to do some further, perhaps, learning. And if you fancy becoming a member and you're not already one, that's your final QR code. And thank you very much for coming. I should say, sorry, we're going to the pub. So if you want to join us, we're going to the Swan Tavern around the corner. I believe Harriet there will lead the way.
Follow me to the pub.